Do you live over there?
No, I grew up in White. I'm a third generation Whitewater. I
Uh-huh.
moved to Cleveland Heights because they my family owned it.
Uh-huh.
Now more of the athletic football fields are there.
Uh-huh.
And I thought about going back and visiting there. It was about the time that the whole thing about the clinic undermining the Lakewood Hospital happened, and I was so put off by the collaboration with the clinical mayor and everything.
Yeah.
It just sort of tore it right there.
Yeah.
So,
Uh, yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Is that I've never been to that theater on Detroit Shoreway. Yeah, it's really. I've heard it's really nice. And do they have what kind of? Do they have plays in there
yeah,
too?
it's kind
And
of usual Freedom Cinema stuff.
yeah.
And then they do some of the specialty things like the, I don't know whether they do the Lakeland ones there, but they do some of the ones where people from the Natural History Museum come and talk about the film afterward, what was real science and what was just hoped up for the film.
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh,
but apparently they're in some degree of financial trouble because
mhm.
hopefully we get them to restart.
Okay, Shirley. Thanks for letting me know about these things.
Yeah,
Appreciate that. Hey, how's it going? Good. Okay, so we're all about cleansing the energy and cleansing the space. So this is why my dear friend Kim decided that we needed to incorporate this as part of our offerings to just show you a different way to heal. This is a very different way to heal. It's an ancient way to heal. I have crystals up here that have been absorbing the sound from the singing bowls. And the metal singing bowls, which are called Tibetan bowls, are actually hammered with a particular amount of metals. There's brass in there, maybe even a little gold and copper. And it's said that when the monks make these bowls, that they actually hammer them with prayers. So each little indentation you see indicates a prayer that was infused into the metal. And I think that's really kind of special. And I don't want to be remiss in thanking Environmental Health Watch and Kim Foreman for allowing me to present today. And this is my particular libation, my particular offering. I was going to try to do a traditional libation, but I don't want to not do it justice. So this is my lane. My lane is music. My lane is food. And so this is why we're here today. I brought with me two of the most talented musicians ever. Yes, and I'm going to say that in public. Brother Ishmael Douglas on guitar over here. And Brother Chano Gibson. on percussions. So today we would like to do a song by Sam Cooke. And I'm going to infuse this song with a song that I've been singing all over the country. Some of you probably know that song, but I'm going to do it with a little bit of a twist today. And also, I think I'm going to try to take a little bit of artistic license because I do believe in the power of words and how words shape things. So in one of the verses in the song that I'm going to sing, Change Gonna Come, there's going to be a little tiny bit of a variation. And I hope this doesn't catch you too off guard, but it's actually, I changed it because that is the sentiment that I want to put out there for us as a people to be more helpful for each other. So you'll probably know it when you hear it. Okay, we ready? I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movies and I go downtown, and somebody keeps telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Now when I go to my brother and I say, brother, won't you help me please? And my dear brother looks down to me and he reaches out his hand and helps me to my feet. Well, there have been times when I thought I wouldn't last too long, but now I know I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know Do you believe trouble don't last always? We're gonna make it, y'all. Believe in yourself. You know, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. We're seeds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. We start with, I'm Tim Black I'm the acting director of the Social Justice Institute here at Case Western, and we start with a land acknowledgement. The practice of giving a land acknowledgement stems from both indigenous tradition and modern protocol. It is my honor this evening to lead us in recognizing the land upon which we reside and express our gratitude and appreciation to those who lived and worked here before us. From the ancient Panther people to the ancestors of contemporary Ojibwe, Lakota, Shawnee, Wyandot peoples of Northeast Ohio who hunted, fished, and gathered here, to the Lenape and Six Nations people who sought refuge in Northeast Ohio during the Indian Wars of our colonial days. We recognize their resilient spirit and thank them for passing on knowledge of plants and animals that has sustained human life for thousands of years. It was their stewardship and soft footprint that make our residence possible on this once indigenous territory. So as we enter our second day of our two-day conference, please take just a moment to reflect on how your lives might represent this long-standing indigenous tradition of caring for the earth, each other, and future generations. And let it remind us of different histories and ancestry in the room. We heard a lot last night about ancestry, and especially about the knowledge that is passed down as it pertains to race, food, and justice. Let us not forget in our reflections the people who made our country with their unpaid labor, and then later underpaid labor, the people with no names in our history books. But let us also embrace their knowledge that can help to nourish and guide us. For we recognize that a big part of our battle is the battle of who controls the narrative. Who gets to tell the story? And which stories are we going to tell? Aho. So welcome, everyone. So I was very moved and inspired by the presentations last night. It resonated with me in so many ways. It resonated with my biography. Where I grew up, we raised our own food. But this was long before terms like organic farming and urban homesteading and fresh food. We called it supper. If we didn't grow it and can it for the winter, we didn't have supper. Or else we had the alternative, which was, of course, the inexpensive processed foods for economically distressed families like Spam and Velveeta cheese and so on. But more importantly, as I was driving home last night, I was just thinking about some of the conversations, discussions, recognizing food is such a powerful metaphor. In fact, I was thinking about how the title of this conference, the food movement through a social justice lens, how we might even flip that and think about social justice through a food lens. There's so many different associations that were made last night, and just for those of you who weren't here, Sophia Buggs talking about food as a form of healing, especially healing from injustices. Kima Durden from Riddall talking about food as community building. Food as a form of meaningful work, where through the interaction of the material worlds, our intellectual capacities, and our spirits, we create our own worlds and ourselves in the process as human beings. In other words, food work as an antidote to alienating work that we are so accustomed to today, where others control our work and profit from our work. And then there was the 21-year-old Allison Carpenter, who just simply blew me away, who critically examined capitalism and the priority of profit over people and health, who was willing to discuss openly capitalism and its racial formations that engender structural violence, racial segregation, concentrated poverty, and food deserts, in which she reminded us food deserts that are so quickly converted into resource-rich areas when capital decides to invest in them and create playgrounds for the rich. Allison confirmed what I'm seeing among many young people on campus today, their willingness to use the C word, their willingness to challenge the acronym TINA that was made famously popular by Prime Minister Maggie Thatcher in the 1980s, that there is no alternative. Students want to talk about alternatives to capitalism. There's something very significant and important stirring among our young people. So all of these themes from last night reflect back on the organization of power, as well as on the brave, courageous work that goes into analyzing, criticizing, and organizing to challenge, resist, and transform power, and to advance the human project for liberation and emancipation. And tonight, we are going on to deepen that conversation. But before I introduce tonight's keynote speakers, I want to make two announcements and then thank some organizations and individuals. First of all, there are a number of student organizations on campus that are working on a criminal justice reform ballot initiative. They're trying to get this ballot initiative on the ballot for November. I want to introduce you to Tarun. For those of you who have not yet met Tarun, if you're interested in supporting this, you know there's a lot of hard work that goes into these ballot initiatives. We have to get 300,000 signatures. The work is to take lower level felonies and to reduce them to misdemeanors, take that money, put it into addiction services, to try to increase the amount of good time that inmates can earn inside and so forth. So if you're interested in learning more and supporting it, please see Tarun. Secondly, this is a save the date moment. We've just finished organizing an event that will occur on July 14th and 15th in commemoration of the Glenville Uprising 50 years ago. The title of it will be MLK 50, Glenville 50, commemorating the Glenville Uprising and its legacy 50 years later through the lens of 4 generations. We will have some of the surviving leaders of the Black nationalist and civil rights movement from that time will be here to speak. And then we will have a series of panels across the 2 days that will represent 4 different generations to talk about Black activism, the legacy of Black activism in Cleveland. Janice Eatman-Williams is helping to organize that. Janice, you want to stand up? And anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about this, you can talk to Janice. The theme will be, where do we go from here, community or chaos? Which some of you will recognize, of course, is Dr. King's last book title. So I want to thank our sponsors, the Environmental Health Watch, the Riddall Green Partnership, and the Social Justice Institute. I want to thank our funders, Sisters of Charity Foundation and St. Luke's Foundation, with additional support from the Alliance of the Great Lakes, Cuyahoga County, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, and Neighborhood Connections. I want to thank our musicians, Lena Boswell, Dwayne A. Douglas, and Chano Gibson. I want to thank Sylvia Clayton for the flower arrangements. She was really gorgeous. I want to thank the planning team and ask them to stand as I call out their names. I want to start particularly with Kim Foreman. Kim insisted that. Kim kept insisting, this is all democratic. We're all participating and we're all collaborating. Kim's leadership is what really moved this project forward. We really appreciate it, Kim. Shai White, who was right next to her through this whole process. Shai, there she is. Kima Durden, Allison George, Hunter Scott, Justine Lindeman, Wendy Moore. Wendy Moore's here somewhere, yeah. Rhonda Williams, and Lisa Collins. Lisa, who is the Institute Administrator, who's usually not in here when we recognize her name. She's usually sitting out there doing the work at the table. So when you leave here at some point during the evening, say hello and thank Lisa for all the work that she does. All right, now on to introducing Dr. White. This is Dr. Black introducing Dr. White. All right? Dr. White is an assistant professor. You can read her full biography in the program, but I'm going to hit the highlights. All right. So Dr. White's assistant professor of environmental justice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research investigates communities of color and grassroots organizations engaged in the development of sustainable community food systems as a strategy to respond to issues of hunger and food inaccessibility. She is the author of Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement, which is out in October, right? Which will be out in October. The book provides an historical foundation that will add meaning and context for current conversations regarding the resurgence of agriculture in the context of food justice sovereignty movements in urban spaces like Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, New York City, and of course, Cleveland. In addition to her academic work, Dr. White is the past president of the board of directors of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and she's I have a feeling we're going to hear about that organization again shortly. And she serves on the advisory boards of Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network and the Black Oak Center for Sustainable and Renewable Living. As a result of her scholarship and community work, Dr. White has received several grants and awards, and again, I encourage you to read about her in the program. Malik Kenyatta Yakini is co-founder and executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. The organization operates D-Town Farm, a 7-acre farm in Detroit, and is also spearheading the opening of the Detroit Food Commons and the Detroit People's Food Co-op in Detroit's North End. In addition, Malik has led efforts to establish the Detroit Food Policy Council, was a member of the Michigan Food Policy Council, and serves on the steering committee of Undoing Racism in the Detroit Food System. From 1990 to 2011, he was executive director for Soroma Institute Public School Academy, one of Detroit's leading African-centered schools. Mr. Yakini was honored as Administrator of the Year by the Michigan Association of Public School Academies in 2006, and he served on the board of directors of Timbuktu Academy of Science and Technology from 2004 to 2011. Lastly, Malik is also featured in the books Blacks Living Green and the movie Urban Roots. We are honored to have both of you here with us this evening. We're going to start with Dr. White. All of us will sit up here and we'll have some questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Black. There's a joke up in there somewhere. Ooh, how y'all feeling? All right. Yes. So it is a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to come and to talk to you about some of the work that will be in the book that's forthcoming. I feel like this is a familiar place because we've been here before. And the work has really progressed in some really meaningful ways, and I offer these ideas to help you as you all are grappling with, right here? Can you see me? Okay, this thing is, okay. All right, so as we grapple with organizing or creating organizations that will support community wellness. And as we really think about designing sustainable communities, I think that the ideas of the past have lots to offer us in terms of how we forge forward. And so before I start, I want to thank everybody that handled the logistics, Shai, Kim, Shelley, and to Rhonda, who is not here but has done so much for all of us. And I just kind of wanted to honor her presence in this space for the work that she's done. It is an honor and a privilege to talk to you about this work. And hopefully my intentions are three. I want you to walk out of here with three ideas. One, I want to offer historical analysis that reconnects us to our agricultural roots. Two, I want to talk about the importance of cooperatives in establishing sustainable community wellness. And three, I want us to think about the ways that what we're trying to do, the ways that our ideas today in terms of urban agriculture have been done by our ancestors and our elders, but those stories are yet to be unearthed. And so this is sort of a beginning of continued work, and I'm hoping that you get bit by some bug that helps you want to ask some questions, either about your own racial identity and agriculture, Black folks in agriculture, cooperatives. I think that these are all important, critical stories, and so this is my story for you. Before I start, I like to start by honoring my grandparents. This is my grandmother and my grandfather, Granddaddy Kenneth and Grandma Pearl. It wasn't until I finished the book and the book will be coming out with UNC Press. I finished the book and was talking to an aunt of mine, and I just asked my aunt, I said, when I was little and I used to go down to North Carolina, eat in North Carolina, my grandparents' house, they had a store in the front of the house. So the store was in the front of the house where somebody's living room might be. And my mother would always say, Daddy, don't let that baby go in there and eat up all that candy in the store, all the gum and all this. And of course, as good grandparents, she let me eat whatever I wanted. But there was a story behind the store, and I didn't know what the story was until just recently, after I had finished the book, writing the book about cooperatives. I knew my granddaddy was a farmer, but what I didn't know was that he was a member of an agricultural cooperative after I wrote the book. Talk about writing as being autobiographical. So what I asked my aunt, she said it was called the community store. And there were 9 other farmers who pulled their resources in. And the store was the place where Black farmers could get resources, either farm inputs and or the housing supplies, things that they needed for their homes, and be treated with respect, called the community store. They also communally owned a vehicle. So this, as fuzzy as it is an actual picture of my granddaddy in that grocery store. He's no longer with us, but this just tells me how powerful it is for you to find your passion and to follow wherever that work leads you. I like to start with the words of Benjamin Carr. The reason I have always wanted to be a farmer is because I believed then and believe now that the farmer is the only free man we have in our race. So for Benjamin Carr in 1914, the importance of agriculture was because he believed that by feeding himself, he would then be able to provide for his family and wouldn't be dependent upon anybody else. This voice, this sentiment, these ideas of agriculture as liberatory have been dropped from our historical record. When we think about agriculture, especially when we think about agriculture and Black folks, we think about sharecropping, tenant farming, and slavery. And yet, while these are all important parts and components of our historical past, it's not the whole story. And in knowing that there was more to the story, I was committed to unearthing that story. And these ideas, these thoughts are part of that narrative that I want to share with you today. So what do we know about agriculture and Black folks? We often talk about, as I mentioned, the history of oppression, but there's also a history of resistance. We think and talk about migration as the reason that Black folks didn't want to farm and that's why they migrated. And I argue it's not that they didn't want to farm, it's that they didn't want to continue to work in these exploitive, oppressive conditions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have continued to farm in places like Chicago, Detroit, right, Cleveland, those places whose grandparents didn't grow their own food. And so I argue that it was the oppressive conditions and the dispossession and the violence that was a part of the Southern sharecropping tendency. And also, I think that this work really seeks to change the frame and gets us to think differently about the stories and the narratives that we're told, especially with regard to agriculture. So the research questions that really guide the work that I've done and will lead the comments for today. How have Black farmers organized in collectives and cooperatives as a strategy against racial and economic oppression? How might cooperatives function within food justice communities in an effort to work toward community wellness? So the idea is that independently we can only do so much, but collectively we can do so much more. The work of Dr. Jessica Nimhart really sort of talks about cooperatives as an economic force. And my work sort of concentrates on the agricultural cooperatives as a condition. When we grow our own food and we know what food allows us to do, we can then see how food adds to and leads to a liberatory frame, especially when we pull our resources together. And so I want to look back, and using the idea of Sankofa, I want to look backward to move forward, because I think that in order for us to get more young people involved in resistance and growing food and interested in these kinds of conversations, we have to change the narrative. The narrative that we commonly hear is no longer functional, and therefore we need to look to see in our own history where we've been. So in similar ways, we were in, Baba Malik and I were in the Uber, and we were talking to the Uber driver and talking about this relationship between Detroit and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland. And one of the things that, we recognize that these Rust Belt cities have a lot in common. So Detroit being an example, how are people talking about Detroit? Well, I use this because I think that it's an important way to juxtapose the frame that many people think about versus the frame that those of us in resistance and liberatory movements view the city. So here, an award-winning author has written a book called Detroit, An American Autopsy. Well, if you know anything and I know anything, something must be deceased in order to have an autopsy. Why don't you tell that to the beautiful people that I know that are a part of the food movement that are using what is there to rebuild? And so instead of looking and thinking about Detroit as an autopsy, how about we think about it as compost? Right? And so how many farmers do we have? Growers in the house? We have growers? So compost is this nutrient-rich, right, source, life from another form that then provides the nutrients for the next iteration. And if Detroit put the world on wheels, what else can we learn from 313? Okay. So I think that this, transformation of using somebody else's phrase doesn't work for us. And so we're going to be using and thinking about our own language to decide and to discuss our strategies and our history and our past with regard to agriculture. And so people often talk about farmers as passive and not agents committed to and involved in civil rights. And that's what I hope this work will do. Baba Malik will come and talk about what's happening in Detroit in a contemporary sense. I'm going to give you some of the sort of historical ways to talk and think about agriculture. As you all think about what I'm talking about, also think about the ways that these ideas may be helpful for the organizations that you're involved in and trying to find ways to meet people's needs through providing food. Where are the ways that farmers were involved in politics, and where are those voices? I love this picture, and I wanted to use it as a cover of my book, but we could. You know how you find stuff on the internet, you don't know where it comes from or to whom it gets the credit, so we couldn't use it. But I love this image because it is clearly a black farmer, and he's clearly upset that this economic system doesn't work for him, and he's withdrawing his work in effort to make sure that he fights for those rights. So there is this history of black folks in agriculture, and I think we often forget about 100 years ago, who I call the three wise men, and the strong sister that shows us what it looks like. So we can't ignore Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington said, if you have institutions that are not established for you, then build your own. Tuskegee is still active and still very much involved in agriculture, and its importance needs to be recognized. Du Bois, his work really talks about the power of the collective. And his work argues, especially some of his work on cooperatives, he says cooperatives, the system of racial segregation creates an opportunity. Within this segregation, although we are not fully involved in, the economic system as we'd like, we can organize amongst black folks and use this segregation as an opportunity to pull our resources together to build the kinds of relationships, the political knowledge of building and establishing cooperatives, such that we can then engage. And so I think that this power of the collective is an important message for all of us. You can't talk about anything without recognizing the importance of George Washington Carver. I consider him the father of sustainable agriculture. He comes 50 years before Rodale. Folks talk about Rodale as the father, but how can you be the founder if you don't give credit to those who came before? And when everybody else was talking about, don't worry about the soil, there's more where that came from, George Washington Carver said, no. Use everything, reduce, recycle, reuse, and was also active in doing that in terms of the resources that were provided in his laboratories. And of course, we have to think and talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, who I'll spend a bit of time talking about what did freedom farms look like. So most people think about her work in electoral politics and getting us the right to vote. What we don't often recognize is her work once she returned home to establish Freedom Farms Agricultural Cooperative, 680 acres. They had a mobile medical unit, they had community farms, they had commercial kitchens, and all kinds of the things that we think are new. Sister Fannie was doing it way before there was a popularity around it, right? So the scholarship that we sort of recognize, especially when we talk about cooperatives, as I mentioned, is Dr. Nemhard's important book, Collective Courage, where she talks about the history of African-American economic cooperatives, but also Du Bois features really prominently in this work, this rich, long history. A Dusk of Dawn was semi-autobiographical, and in that, he sort of talks about these loosely defined organizations of producer and consumer co-ops, and those who believed in the power of the cooperative. So Du Bois figures really prominently in talking and thinking about what cooperatives are, what they do, and how can they be used. One piece he studied, he theorized, and he also created. And so this is a different way of thinking about what Du Bois does is he allows us to honor and respect the history of scholar activism, and not just talking about it and not just studying it, but also doing it. And so he wrote this piece, Economic Cooperation, which is tremendous. It's beautiful, beautifully written. He theorized, Baba Malik introduced me to this concept of resource regeneration opposed to resource extraction. The idea here is that when a store comes into your neighborhood, they come in, they take the money, and those monies go straight to the shareholders or to the offices. But when you have a cooperative, that is a resource regeneration model where that money can continue to work its way throughout that community. So for me, Du Bois's ideas remind us of resource regeneration, creating a living wage, better work conditions, affordability, and the possibility for distribution. He also created the Negro Cooperative Guild in 1918. And so his idea was that it's important for us to think about what is the best strategy for us to politically, economically, and socially use this as a moment and use the skills that we have as growers to do something to build a sustainable community. His idea was really an asset-based approach opposed to a deficit model. So a lot of times the academy, we can look at, you can read in the abstract almost, to hear how people talk about a community to see if it's going to be based on an asset-based or a deficit model. If you go into a community as a researcher and you say, okay, I'm going to tell you all the things that are wrong, that's the wrong approach. Every community has something upon which it can be built. Every community has an asset. Excuse me. And when you start with assets, you can think about the difference. If somebody comes to your house and they say, I'm going to do an asset-based approach versus a deficit model, just think about how you feel as your home is being described. I think that researchers take the same kind of approach to our communities in either an asset-based or deficit model, and I encourage us to think more of an asset-based approach. So as I said earlier, the segregation created an opportunity that the shared buying based on the needs of the consumer was the way that these cooperatives could survive. He had a systems analysis that was very consistent with what we now call the food system. So somebody would produce it, somebody else would prepare it, somebody else would transport it, and somebody else would, And so just thinking about the ways that he talks about the cooperatives based on agricultural co-ops and upon the producer allowed for us to pull our resources together. In addition, what he said wasn't also important was, as you organize, you also have to educate. We have to educate and create new models and talk and think about new models. You were talking about the sister who was critiquing capitalism. In order for us to think about something different, we have to know what those different systems are. And a part of that conversation is a part of political education. There exists today a chance for the Negroes to organize a cooperative state within their own group, letting Negro farmers feed Negro artisans, Negro technicians guide Negro home industries, and Negro thinkers plan in this integration of cooperation. While Negro artists dramatize and beautify the struggle, economic independence can be achieved. To doubt that this is possible is to doubt the essential humanity and quality of the brains of the American Negro. Now, if that doesn't make you feel encouraged, doesn't make you feel like we can do everything, like the ways that he's talking about the power of the collective and this systems approach to really sort of analyzing the ways that we can transform our community is really encouraging. We not only build and finance Negro churches, but we furnish a considerable part of the funds for our segregated schools. We furnish most of our own professional services in medicine, pharmacy, dentistry, and law. We furnish some part of our food and clothes, our home building and repairing, and many retail services. We furnish books and newspapers. We furnish endless personal supplies like those of barbers, beauty shop keepers, hotels, and restaurants, 1940. Can you imagine what a community looks like when we allow all of our greatness and our brilliance to meet the needs of all of us? George Washington Carver, there's probably no subject more important than the study of food. You see why I love him? He was so ahead of his time, just really committed to understanding what food allows us to do. And so just by way of just a quick overview, not all the organizations were officially considered cooperatives. Many were collectives or just Black farmers that pulled their resources together. Many of these organizations I've dated all the way back to the late 1800s. And so at an economic downturn, we have seen Black folks return to agricultural traditions and to pull their resources by coming together. So cooperatives we know to be jointly owned, democratically controlled, emphasize people over profit, shared social, cultural, and economic aspirations, in addition to promoting peace and democracy. And so this is why the cooperative movement there's an opportunity for us to join with the cooperative movement if the cooperative movement is also committed to freedom. Right? And so we need to be having these kinds of conversations. So a lot of the research that I did came from, as I mentioned, I studied organizations as far back as the late 1800s, the Colored Farmers Alliance. They had 1.2 million farmers throughout the South. This is the late 1800s before the internet, folks. Can you imagine how all these folks were able to pull their money together, pull their resources together, buy land, buy seeds, shared labor, created these trading posts, and what a difference that made in terms of their ability to stay on the land and to do what they needed to do. So for the scholarship, I went to several different archives: Mississippi Department of History, the Amistad Collection, Wisconsin Historical Society, Tuskegee, Birmingham, Alabama State Archives, Schaumburg, and the Walter Reuther Archives. The examples of the organizations: the Colored Farmers Alliance, Baldwin Farms, Southwest Alabama Farmers Cooperative, New Communities, Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Freedom Farm Cooperative, and I just came back from Waco, Texas, working on the archives of FIST, the Farmers Improvement Society of Texas, FIST, right on, where the password was freedom. Right, is that black enough? All right, y'all. And so we fought back. We organized and we fought back, right? And so these trends that I've identified in looking at over 40, 50, and the only reason I have about 50 the titles, but I don't have a lot of records. So my call for you today is, for whatever organization you're working with, please make sure that you keep the records. 100 years from now, there may be somebody who wants to know what happened on April 20th, 2018, in your function, in your meeting, what happened, what are you doing? And please make sure that you keep some form of record just because. And so I don't have a lot of records. There are lots of organizations where I just had the title to, I didn't have any papers, but I wrote them down, and I'm still trying to track down and keep a running list of all these various different organizations. But what we found are these different kinds of trends, right? That these economic downturns led to Black folks organizing cooperatives, post-Reconstruction, Depression, post-civil rights, today, and that these this collective action and these cooperatives are seen as a form of justice. So my question is, how might we retrieve our social justice history? How might we retrieve this history as a pathway forward? So from organizing the papers, I went through and I identified the different things that they did. What did they do? How did they describe what they did? And then I categorized them, thematically sort of organized them into different categories. There's a methodological conversation. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to. I don't want to bore the folks who are not necessarily interested in the nuts and bolts of it, but just kind of writing down what they did, categorizing it, and here's what we found. I came up with this idea, this theoretical framework called collective agency and community resilience. Collective agency, I think, is important because typically we think about agency as making a decision that you want to bring about a change. Often, agency is studied as a psychological construct. What is it that made you do something different? But I think this fails to understand why it is that there are lots of folks that are doing the same thing. So when it happens amongst a larger group of people, how do we articulate agency as a collective? Right? Resilience. Often we think about resilience post-trauma. So you can think about what happened in Puerto Rico or in the islands. You can think about in Katrina. Anytime you have a catastrophic event, what do we always say? Oh, the people are so resilient. They come together. They look out for each other. I think resilience is a response to a catastrophic event. But I also think to use resilience without interrogating the structural factors that led to the vulnerability for some communities over others is irresponsible, right? So you can't just say the people are strong, but also let's interrogate the structural factors that made certain communities more vulnerable than others. So this theoretical framework, collective agency and community resilience, has three strategies. One, commons as praxis. 2, prefigurative politics, and the 3rd, economic autonomy and independence. And I'm offering these to you and your organizations as a way to sort of think about both what have folks done before, but what are some of the ways that this could incite, inform, how do you organize the activities of your organization, and is this accurate? If you think that I'm missing something, please share that with me. But if you think that this is helpful, then share that with me also. So what is collective agency? Collective agency, the social actor's ability to create and enact behavioral options necessary to affect their political future. I think that community resilience, ways to adjust, withstand, and absorb disturbance, and to reorganize while undergoing change. It emphasizes structural approaches and community engagement, including types of indigenous knowledge, emotional expressions, interracial exchanges that communities need in order to adapt to unforeseen conditions. So the theoretical framework offers these 3 strategies. Commons as praxis. It's an organizing strategy that emphasizes community well-being and wellness and benefit for all. What does this look like? It often looks like a shared ideology. People move from the individual I to the collective we. Conversations such as cooperative and collective, community decisions around shared spaces and resources like land, water, and seeds, and also moving from an oppressive condition to one toward liberation. So here's an example from Fannie Lou Hamer. No individual has title to or complete use of the land. In order for any people or nation to survive, land is necessary. Cooperative ownership opens the door to many opportunities for group development of economic enterprises, which develop the total community rather than create monopolies that monopolize the resources of a community. So Hamer is telling you that individual isn't the way to go. Right? She's giving us this language to really think about how can we make collective decisions for the benefit of all of us. Prefigurative politics is not my concept. Prefigurative politics just sort of thinks about and talks about the construction of alternative political systems that are democratic and include processes of self-reflection. Often for Black folks who were unable to participate in the electoral process, created these organizations where they were able to participate politically within the organization. And that's where the one person, one vote becomes important. So the idea is, even though we can't participate in the larger, bigger, broader, it's important that we sort of learn how to participate, learn how to vote, learn how to discuss issues to vote upon, so that the world we're creating in our organization gives the rest of the world something to model after. Does that make sense? Prefigurative politics. So when you have people that are excluded from the political process, we establish these free spaces for the now ancestor Winnie Mandela talks about the garden as a free space. People thought they were growing food, but they were out there organizing and talking about how to overthrow apartheid, right? I see some nods, y'all like, yeah, right? These free spaces where we can talk about ideas. It's a process of self-management and emphasizes political participation, or political education. Economic autonomy, it's a goal to which we strive, right? It's an alternative system of resource exchange within the community with direct benefits for its members. Resource regeneration versus extraction, as I've already mentioned. Alternative economies and currency, like bartering, but also cooperative and collective. And so from these previous organizations, I have a sense of the ways that we can develop, establish resilient communities while also interrogating the structural factors that make certain communities more vulnerable than others. Resilient communities recognize that there's a relationship and a connection between all of these issues. You can't be concerned about food without being concerned about water, land, education, employment, safety, security, transportation, housing, and healthcare. So all of these issues are definitely linked, and the cooperative allows us a mechanism for us to have these conversations, to work and to build together. Let's see what Fannie Lou did. Sister Fannie Lou, would you please? Sister Fannie, they kicked me off the plantation. They set me free. It's the best thing that could happen. Now I can work for my people. She was fired from her job and evicted from her home for attempting to register to vote. But her analysis, now mind you, this is a woman who had a 6th grade education, and we say 6th grade because she went to school 6 times, but you also understand in Mississippi, it was after the harvest and before planting. So that was like December to maybe April. Right? And so her analysis of food of the restriction of food as oppressive is clear in this comment. Down in Mississippi, they killing Negroes of all ages on the installment plan through starvation. If you're a Negro and you vote, if you persist in dreams of black power to win some measure of freedom in the white-controlled counties, you go hungry. There is a way to fight back against the nonviolent weapon of white officialdom, where a couple of years ago, white people were shooting at Negroes trying to register. Now they say, go ahead and register, then you'll starve. So for her, she was like looking at the situation and she said, okay, so you're gonna starve us to force us to move from Mississippi. Now the conversation in Mississippi, really, we need to have that talk. Baba A.K. wrote that book, We Will Shoot Back. But I think that Mississippi was really important to the black freedom struggle for a lot of reasons. That's a whole nother conversation, but that was where more African Americans were in the majority without the right to vote. And so it was important to get black folks out of Mississippi. It was important. Right? That's a whole nother talk, y'all. We got to come back to this one. But I just want you to know that inasmuch as she identified hunger as a tool of oppression, she also viewed food as a strategy toward freedom. So Harry Belafonte wrote a letter for Freedom Farms Agricultural Cooperatives in 1969. In the letter says, now to give hundreds of landless poor people a chance at self-help, economic self-sufficiency, and political power, Mrs. Hamer has organized a farm cooperative. Acreage of fertile soil is available to the cooperative at exceptionally low cost. A community of free, independent people can be built if financial help is given at this time. So you see how he's making a relationship between land, skills that folks know, which is how to grow, and the importance of a cooperative and a collective. So these were the ideas that were active in the late 60s. So what did coming together allow them to do? Let's take a look. This is Sister Fannie Lou in the coat and scarf, and she's at the cooperative store. What they did, they planted the food in the community growing spaces. 10% of all that was harvested went into the bank for those who could not work the field. There were a few years where they were so concerned, they had so much food that they actually sent it all the way to Chicago, black folks in urban areas, right? This is the pig bank. It's a little fuzzy. I actually met the photographer who lives in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a strange connection between work. But the pig bank, this is the first Heifer International project. And what they did was they would give a family a pregnant pig. Once they had the babies, you would turn in 2 babies back into the pig bank. Those babies then would be raised and would be given to somebody else. And that way the family could enjoy whatever, the pig was, they called it a bank on legs, right? You could eat it, you could sell it, you could do so much with the pig that the pig was an investment. It was sort of like a micro-lending strategy of allowing people to do more. And so they were donated 50 pigs by the National Council of Negro Women and passed on that wealth and served over 300 families in the first few years. This is a picture of the sewing cooperative. And these sewing machines came from an organization called Measure for Measure, a white philanthropic organization, progressive whites and clergy who believe that our job is to raise the money to send the money down south to do whatever they wanted to for the cause of racial liberation, right? And so really important sort of story and strategy, but I think it's beautiful. The cooperative also had a daycare so that the people who worked in the sewing cooperative could have also make sure that their children were taken care of. And you see the brothers were also in the sewing cooperative. They were leathersmiths. I like the sign in the back, think young, think Andrew Young. They had tractors and they had all the tools were shared. And the harvest, the money from the land payments were made by the produce. And so all of the tractors, all the tools were shared amongst everyone. This is the tool, they had a tool bank with a farm manager. The subsistence crops and cash crops were used to pay the land mortgage. They had contracts with Atkins Pickles and Heinz Ketchup. This is 100 acres for low-income, high-quality housing that they built. And just look at the contrast. This is 100 acres. This is a blueprint. Here is a picture of what the sharecropping homes look like. You can see that a good wind will go straight from the front. They call them shotgun houses. Here are the houses that Fannie Lou built. And Fannie Lou believed that once people are fed, they can engage in all other kinds of important intellectual and economic political activities. And so you see that it says, hey, make sure, here, you're a member of this organization. We also want to make sure that you vote, participate in the political process. And so I love this because she was telling folks that the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service was a place where folks were making decisions about how money was spent. And they wanted to make sure that the black folks in the community were represented. And so once we have access to food, access to housing, access to education, participation in the political process, or the transformation of a political process in the way that builds up a community in the eyes of those who live there was also critical. So what are some of the lessons from Freedom Farms? I think that, people often, I had a research assistant the first year who, how new grad students can be. I've been studying Fannie Lou for a couple years, and I have her just kind of helping, the process. And she came into my office one day and she says, Dr. White, I'd like to talk about your research. I'm like, okay, Miss Thang, come on, let's talk about my work. So she said, well, I've read a few things. Well, it's always going to be trouble. When I read a few things, come on with it. I read a few things, and I don't hear anybody else talking about Freedom Farms. I said, you don't, do you? She said, so I'm wondering if by chance you're not overstating the data. Yes, she did. Yes. I won't tell you all of what happened in that meeting. I pointed her to some really important readings, such as Presumed Incompetent, and we had some real important talks about, here's what I asked you to do, and let's have a talk, right? But I also think that she had missed the fact that as academics, it's our job to go and hear the stories or follow the string to see where it comes from and to create new knowledge and not just say what everybody else has already said. Now we do hear lots of folks talking about Freedom Farms. And so whether or not anybody else had said it before or paid as much attention, that wasn't the issue. The issue is this is a story that needs to be told and upheld for the work that we're trying to do, because I argue that our current moment is accepting the baton from Sister Fannie Lou as we do the work today. Agriculture as resistance. We clearly hear if hunger is the oppressor, agriculture becomes a strategy toward freedom. Community building as resistance. And we know that when we're able to feed ourselves, as Reverend Paris tells me, when you can feed yourself, you can free yourself. This is a conversation that's been happening for over 100 years amongst Black folks, and the importance of cooperatives. So for me, cooperatives, more than sell food, offer an opportunity for employment. We can do power analyses and what have you. But I also think it's important for us to think about the work of cooperatives as they're connected to community-based food systems, right? The role and importance of urban agriculture being connected to food hubs and making sure distribution is equal. Creating and establishing commercial and community kitchens, also establishing value-added products, CSAs in some form, just often not in the mystery box. Right? And often not in a $700 at the beginning of the season. If you want folks to be able to contribute, you have to find a new way. And I like the work that they're doing in the Healthy Food Hub in Chicago with Black Oaks Center for Sustainable Renewable Living. They call it a reverse CSA. It's not a mystery box. You tell them what you will buy, and they will acquire that instead of saying, give me your money, come pick it up, and get you a cookbook because you don't know what to do with a rutabaga. Right? So these are important sorts of conversations, and also apiary. So the long and the short of the publications, I did write a piece, A Pig in a Garden, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farms Cooperative, which is available from Food and Foodways. Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement is coming out this fall. I'm in the process of writing up some USDA data. We had a 5-year, $4 million USDA grant to do interviews with Black and Latinx farmers in Covert, Michigan. That data will be coming out. And Sisters of the Soil, Urban Gardening as Resistance. It's a piece that I did. One of the earlier pieces has been asked to be reprinted, and so I'm actually rewriting it. Because once you read your writing, you go back a couple years, you're like, ooh, I need to redo that. So that'll be coming out in a book on Black food geographies. So in conclusion, I just think that it's important for us to think about the ways that food can lead us toward freedom and liberation. And often, I like that saying, if you don't have any skin in the game, if you don't have a dog in the fight, it ain't your fight. Right, but there's really important ways that we can sort of use cooperatives and pull our resources together and allow agriculture to really establish sustainable communities. One is through community engagement, making sure we do needs assessments, focus groups, power analysis, using asset-based approaches, focusing on a social justice history, identifying community partnerships, and making sure that we have a shared vision, shared political, economic, environmental, and economic vision. And that's it.
All right, peace, peace, peace. How's everyone doing? Good. So I just want to start by saying that always I want to honor my ancestors and our Creator. I always put that first in front of me, always, 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 for multiple reasons. And also, it's a pleasure to be presenting with Monica White. So you all know her as Dr. Monica White. And kind of jokingly, a lot of people call her Mo because her name is Monica. So they were calling her Mo White. I was like, nah, I don't think so. So I started calling her Mo Black, right? So sometimes I just call her Mo B. So it's always a pleasure to be able to co-present with her because although we agree and we work together, we kind of come from different angles. And so she's in the academy doing excellent work. I ain't in the academy. But that's my sister, and I love her. So the other thing is I told Kim I was going to talk about fostering a racially just food system. And I ain't going to do that either. So this is, so what y'all are fixing to get is called the remix, okay? And then also I'm a little surprised because I actually thought the majority of the audience was going to be black, and it's not. And so what I got to say may resonate with you, it may not, I don't know. But so you're about to experience the remix. So, and thank you, Kim. Also, thank you for continuing this conference. This is the fourth? The fourth one, yeah. And I think I've been here for 3 of the 4. So thank you very much for having Detroit Thick up in the house tonight. So I want to first say that I have the privilege of going around the country and speaking a lot. And I feel honored to be able to do that, to share ideas, and also to learn from people in the places that I go. But I always want to point out that I'm a representative of an organization. And so all the people who work in our organization and work at our farm and work with our youth program and work on other projects we have don't necessarily have the chance to go around the country and speak. So I want to always acknowledge them and point out that I'm part of an organized effort because I'm totally committed to the idea that to really move social justice forward, it's not an individual work, but we have to be tied to an organization of people with similar values that are moving that work forward. So I want to give a shout out to my comrades and my brothers and sisters in the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network who are doing excellent work in Detroit. And as Mo B just told you, she was for many years, until about a year ago, our board president. And so we got many people doing work on different levels in the city of Detroit. And we try to work with other black folks in Detroit doing the work and also with all people of goodwill. So I want to tell you a little about, because Monica kind of said, and I think Dr. Black, Dr. White, Dr. Black, which one? Okay. I think Dr. Black, said, or maybe Dr. White said I was going to talk about what's happening in contemporary Detroit. That really isn't part of my presentation, but I'm going to kind of add that in to talk about what our organization is doing before I get into what I had prepared. So Detroit Black Community Food Security Network was founded in 2006. And just to give you a little context, in 2006, Detroit probably had about 710,000 people. In fact, in 2010, the official census data is that there were 713,000 people in Detroit. The 2010 census says that 83% of those were black people. And so in 2006, when we started, Detroit was and is still a predominantly black city. In fact, sometimes we say Detroit is the blackest city in America. Whoop, whoop. Those of us from Detroit, we love Detroit. I'm going to tell you that. And so we unapologetically represent. I ain't hating on Cleveland or wherever else y'all might happen to be from. I'm not hating on that. But just we like real unapologetic, Florida, wherever y'all at. We like real unapologetic about loving Detroit. And Detroit has this real strong history. In fact, if you look at all of the kind of social movements, particularly those in the Black Liberation Movement, which I not only come out of, but I'm still firmly rooted in, all of those organizations had a very strong presence in Detroit. For example, some of you might have heard of a group called the Nation of Islam. Anybody heard of that? A couple people, a few people. Some of y'all might have heard of a group called the Republic of New Africa. Anybody heard of that? Some of y'all might have heard of a church called the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, or the Shrine of the Black Madonna. I see some heads nodding. And also in the labor movement, you know, we had lots of presence in the city of Detroit. So Detroit is really an activist town. And so I feel really proud to come out of that tradition, not come out, I keep saying come out, but to be firmly rooted within that tradition. And so our organization continues in many ways the work of this great tradition of activism in the city of Detroit, and I want to talk specifically about what we do. So when we started in 2006, I mentioned the kind of demographics. The vast majority of the population is black, 700-some thousand people, but all of the groups leading the work that we now would call urban agriculture work or food security work were all white-led nonprofit organizations. And while on one hand, I'm sure that most of the white people leading these nonprofits were good-hearted and wanted to do good things, from our perspective, they were functioning almost like colonists, in that people from outside of our community were coming into the community imposing solutions on us. And so we push back heavily against that. You know, and let me clarify this, since it's a lot of white people in the audience, a lot of them are looking at me like they might want to do some violence to me after this is over. You got my back, Moby? Okay, just check. You got me? Okay, just checking, I'm just checking. Now, these look like nonviolent white people. They're not good. So while I'm sure they had good intentions, we push back heavily against this idea of white people or anybody else really coming into black communities and leading anything. So we're not against white people, right? That's not the point. We're against the system of white supremacy, which suggests to white people that they have the answers for everything, essentially, and have the responsibility to save other people, right? Because they somehow have this unique perspective on the world, and they have the responsibility of sharing this perspective. And so that kind of thinking we push back heavily against. Now, we're all for allies. You know, so for white people who come and work with us at our farm, and we have many people that do that, for those who can follow black leadership, usually we get along really well. For those who don't, you know, who can't humble themselves and follow black leadership within a black space, they usually have a little friction. And so I just want to distinguish between being against white people and being against the system of white supremacy, which impacts everybody in American society, whether you identify yourself as white, black, or any of these other classifications that have been created. And by the way, the whole idea of race, we know, is not a biological reality, right? It's a social construct, but nonetheless, it's a reality in the social sense. So, and we'd be like ostriches with our heads in the sand if we ignored the fact that this racial construct exists within American society. So we started in 2006 to ensure that Detroit's majority black population, African-American population, not only participated in the food movement in a robust way, but because we're the vast majority of the population in Detroit, that we are in the leadership of that movement. And we would like to think that in the 12 years that we've been in existence, that we have to some degree changed the public discourse in the city of Detroit, and perhaps even nationally have helped to contribute to this discourse about racial justice within the food movement. So we do several things. The first thing we do, the largest and most labor-intensive thing that we do that we're best known for, is we run the largest farm in Detroit called D-Town Farm, and we had a couple people in the audience who were, or at least one person, who was there yesterday. Tell me your name again. Lisa. Yeah, Lisa came out and visited yesterday, and what a coincidence, right? In fact, she thought I was speaking here last night, so she was trying to figure out how I was in Detroit and I was going to be here at the same time. So we run D-Town Farm, which last year we grew 38 different fruits, vegetables, and herbs. We train new farmers each year in various ways, both through formal internship programs and through informal volunteering, which occurs. We have a large-scale composting operation. We have a solar power station on the farm. We have a rainwater retention pond. We have an apiary. We're raising bees. We have a youth area we're doing lots of things to create a space that is both a production farm, but it's also a public educational institution. It's kind of a liberated zone, a space where people can come in and have these discussions about social justice and have a space where a lot of the oppressive forces that exist in the largest society are not really functioning. The other thing that we do, though, is we have a youth program. So I'm very much a child of the 1960s and late 1970s. And that time period, as you know, was characterized by rebellion and lots of social turmoil in American society. And one of the things during the early years of my involvement in the movement, many of us were very naive because we thought that in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years that there was going to be a revolution in American society, there's going to be a shift in power, and everything would be cool, right? So we were tremendously naive and didn't really understand that deep social change is a protracted process, and not only is it protracted, but it's intergenerational. So having grown past that naivete, we now understand that if our movement is going to be sustainable, that we have to consciously involve young people in it. So we have a youth program called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program that currently functions at 2 sites in the city of Detroit. And we teach young people how to build raised bed gardens, how to raise crops in those gardens, how to prepare the foods in healthy ways, and most importantly, how to be food justice advocates in their own community so that we're really raising up another generation of food activists. And then the big thing that we're working on now that really consumes most of my time is we're building a building on the main street in Detroit, Woodward Avenue, that's going to be called the Detroit Food Commons. And the Detroit Food Commons will house the Detroit People's Food Co-op. That will be the main tenant in the building. And we're absolutely committed to cooperative development, building on what Dr. White was just saying. We're absolutely committed to cooperative development, and what we see happening both in Detroit and black communities throughout the United States is that other ethnic groups come into our community, generally control the entire retail economy. Our communities become what I call wealth extraction stations, where people set up businesses and just suck all the wealth out of our community. It goes other places, and then we find ourselves in a position where we're going begging other people for jobs and begging people for grants and begging people for resources, whereas what other groups do is they practice what Dr. Claude Anderson calls group economics, right? Where if we take the wealth that we already have and we find ways to stop the hemorrhaging so it's not just bleeding out of our community so that other people benefit from it, and we circulate that within our own communities, then we would have a tremendous amount of wealth that we could use to fund our own self-help efforts. And so in the face of a capitalist economy, which we always like to point out also that we are an anti-capitalist organization, we think that capitalism is a terrible system, both for human beings and for the planet. And so in the face of a capitalist economy, we think that cooperatives are the best opportunity that we have, as has been historically proven. And this is true for all people, but it's particularly true for black people who have been marginalized by an economic system that finds all kinds of ways to keep us from participating fully. So it's extremely important that we practice cooperative economics so that we can find ways to collectively benefit from the wealth that we already have in our communities. So, we hear a lot about Buy Black campaigns, and I'm down with that. We should support black businesses. I'm with that. But the problem with that is that you can have a Buy Black campaign where you're supporting individually owned businesses, sole proprietorships, which doesn't necessarily translate into the black community as a whole rising up or being raised. It may, depending on the consciousness of the business owners, but it could just result in that owner of that business, his or her sons and daughters get to go to college and they buy a nice car and all those kind of things. It doesn't necessarily result in our collective advancement. So cooperatives are the only means that we have really to share that wealth collectively and also to build the capacity to make decisions democratically. So another characteristic of an oppressive system, such as the one that we live in, particularly for black people, is that we're used to being in situations where people are deciding for us, are making decisions. And this is particularly pronounced in Detroit, where for about 18 months, we had what's called an emergency manager, where the powers of all of the elected officials in Detroit were just wiped out, and the governor of the state appointed one individual who had carte blanche to make all the decisions about the city of Detroit. And so that's when the city of Detroit went into bankruptcy under the leadership of this individual appointed by the governor. We still have in many Michigan cities, emergency managers whose powers supersede those of the elected officials. So often people, point to when people look at which way forward for black people, people often point to the electoral system and say, well, we should vote. You got to vote. And I'm not against voting. I think we should vote, but we need to use it in an intelligent way, but we also need to know the limitations. And so we've seen the limitations in Detroit where all the people that Detroit has voted for were just totally disempowered, and one dude appointed by the Republican right-wing racist governor of the state, this one dude had more power than all the elected officials in the city. So in fact, in Detroit, we had two emergency managers, one running the city and one running the school system. And so, we think these are dangerous situations. So anyway, cooperative economics, we think, is a way of us galvanizing our collective power and learning to practice democracy. That's the point I was trying to make. That because in a system where people are deciding for us, we kind of often become complacent and think that the government or corporations or Dan Gilbert or whatever, is going to come in. I know some of y'all in Cleveland love Dan Gilbert. I know. So, some of us think we cede power over our lives to these what we consider to be more powerful forces. And so cooperatives provide a model of democracy where we begin to exercise the muscles of self-determination, of making decisions on our own behalf. And so we need that ability, that container that allows us to learn how to make collective decisions, as well as we need the mechanism to circulate wealth within our communities so that we can benefit from our own labor. So that's what we do. That's what the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network does. What I want to do, and again, this is the remix, is I want to read something to you that I wrote maybe 3 years ago. And it's not directly about food, although I mentioned food in it. But the reason I'm reading this is because I'm of the belief that it's impossible to have food justice unless you have social justice in general. So the fact that we have inequality within the food system is simply a reflection of the inequality that exists in American society as a whole. In fact, I saw some things on Facebook today talking about it's not a Starbucks problem, talking about the arrest of the two brothers in Philadelphia. It's an American problem, right? So it's not Starbucks per se, but this kind of attitude permeates all of the major institutions in American society. So similarly, while the particular lane that we've chosen to do our work is kind of the food system work and trying to make a more just and equitable food system, the reality is that won't exist until we transform the power relationships in society. The same forces that create inequality within the food system are the same forces that create unequal school systems. The same forces that create unequal school systems are the forces that cause black men and women to be incarcerated at ridiculous rates. The same forces that cause black men and women to be incarcerated are the same forces that cause great disparity in the indicators of health between black people and white people. The same forces that cause the differences in health, indicators of health, are the same forces that cause the average white family in America to have 13 times the wealth of the average black family. And so we can't focus on food in isolation. We have to look at food as part of this whole equation. And so what I want to talk to you about is some of the ideas that I think we need to begin to look at as we're looking at how we transform society, with the food system being part of that. So this piece is called Black Ideas Matter. The current resistance movement against police murder, and again, this was written 3 years ago, but some of this still applies today because we're still seeing police murders in the last couple of weeks, right? We've seen a few in Sacramento and other places around the country. So this really hasn't changed even though it's 3 years old. The current resistance movement against police murder and inequities in the so-called justice system have affirmed in a loud, clear voice that Black lives matter. I stand resolutely with those who are disrupting the usual flow of things in order to demand that black people not have to experience fear and intimidation at the hands of racist police who are part of a culture of white supremacy, domination, and black villainization. This is a human rights struggle. It demands that our humanity be recognized and respected. It pushes back against against policies and practices that cut short the quality and quantity of black life. The scattered pockets of resistance forming throughout the country have the potential of moving beyond a loose-knit movement seeking to reform inequities into a movement for fundamental long-term change. What we need is a movement that seeks to redefine power relationships, that seeks to empower black people and others in society who have been historically and systematically shut out, exploited, and disempowered. We need a movement that seeks to achieve measurable gains that improve the real-world quality of life for the majority of our people. A movement that shapes a new society whose policies affirm that black lives matter. But it is also true that black ideas matter. The deep changes that will be required if humanity is to survive and black people and other oppressed communities are to flourish and have self-determination have as much to do with the spaces between our ears as it does with economic and political empowerment. One of the most insidious aspects of the current system of oppression is an intentional and relentless campaign to shape our thinking. Not only does the system of white supremacy give actual real-world privilege to people who are defined as white, but it imposes the values and worldview of Western Europe and her children on the rest of us. Superior weapons can lead to the colonization of an oppressed people, but that relationship will be short-lived unless the minds of the people are colonized as well. The suppression of the historical and cultural memory of the oppressed is a tool used to maintain long-term dominance over a people who have been militarily conquered. The oppressed are taught to forget who they are and are coerced, often forcibly, into seeing themselves and the world through the eyes of their oppressors. To accomplish this, the oppressive system controls the media, popular culture, and schools. Carter G. Woodson spoke to this in his 1933 classic, The Miseducation of the Negro. He said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. Clearly, there is a relationship between what we think and how we act and are treated by others. A necessary component in the struggle to ensure that Black Lives Matter is upholding the fact that black ideas matter. Here's the irony. By suppressing the cultural values, knowledge, and wisdom of the oppressed, the oppressor also denies himself access to the rich, deep well of possibilities alive in the experiences of the oppressed. They begin to believe their own hype. They become arrogant and are convinced that their limited knowledge about the world is sufficient. The reality is that the solutions to many of the problems that make Western systems of manufacturing, energy, food, justice, politics, economics, education, and healthcare unsustainable lie in the values and wisdom of traditional African and other indigenous cultures. Black ideas matter. Those who are most suppressed in society often possess the wisdom and insight needed to transform the society. The Black freedom movement of the 1960s served as a moral barometer that led to widespread questioning of relationships in American society and spurred the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement, and the women's movement. The musicians of the accompanying Black arts movement challenged and transformed the melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic sensibilities of Western music. The movement's writers challenged the colonizers' monopoly on meaning, turning words and phrases on their heads and in the process enriching the language. If the current resistance movement is to morph into a powerful force that will be needed to usher in a new era of self-determination, justice, and planetary stewardship, it will have to challenge many of the ideas that are foundational to Western society. Here are some of those ideas that need to be challenged. Scarcity. Western-style development is driven by the idea that there is not enough for everyone and that each family, community, and nation must compete, obtain, and hoard resources, even if it's to the detriment of others. There is enough, and in fact, this played out a few months ago. Amazon was looking for a new home and considering kind of where to move to, and they were considering Detroit. Did they consider Cleveland also? So you had all these cities like competing for each other, against each other, right, trying to woo Amazon. And we have lots of that, where we see cities and states competing against each other, and certainly we see nations competing against each other for what they consider to be scarce resources. The reality is there's enough for everyone, but we have to be wise and innovative in our use of resources. We have to reduce the tremendous disparity between the 1% who control nearly half of the world's wealth and the 99% of us who have to make do with the rest. Another idea that needs to be challenged is that Greeks are the fathers of philosophy. In spite of the plethora of information to the contrary, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and other Greeks are held up as the fathers of philosophy and science. And I'm intentionally saying fathers because the Greeks really didn't include women in none of this process, right? African scholars have long ago established that ancient Kemet, what many people know as Egypt, is the forerunner and fountainhead of philosophy and the other disciplines upon which the modern world is built, and that after thousands of years, the Greeks became their students. Another idea that needs to be challenged. Food and water are commodities. Multinational corporations and the governments that do their bidding, y'all got that? Use food and water as both wealth generators and weapons. In 2013, Cargill, one of the world's largest traders of grain and other agricultural products, had revenues in excess of $136 billion. The two largest corporations involved in privatizing water, the French conglomerates Suez and Vivendi Universal, currently manage water for more than 200 million people. Access to good, clean, healthy food and water are human rights regardless of your economic status. Now, there's a tremendous trick that's been played on us, I think. And this is just my opinion, I could be wrong. But the Europeans who came here from France, Spain, England, who colonized what we now know as North America and South America and Central America, came from feudal societies where very wealthy people had enclosed the commons. They had taken over land that formerly was collectively used and now said, I own this, and if you want to have access, you got to pay tribute or taxes to me. And then they had people that would enforce that, right? That would go out with weapons if necessary and enforce that. And so this idea that you can own part of the earth came to the Western Hemisphere with these colonizers from Western Europe. And for the most part, we continue to unquestionably accept this concept that you can own part of the earth. Who has the authority to give you a deed for part of the earth? Who? You know, I mean, it's a con game, really, and it's all based on power. So, you know, Western Europeans came here, conquered this land, and, you know, through things like the Indian Removal Act, actually, you know, either moved out indigenous people or actually killed them, you know, wiped them out in order to free up the land for Western expansion. So, and then they started issuing deeds. So there's no moral authority involved in this. It's just a question of power, of who has the power to define things. And so as we're moving from where we are to the type of society that we like to see, I would challenge you to really begin to think about this concept of private land ownership and how we begin to move past that in our thinking. Now, the reality is this also. So I'm both an idealist and I'm a realist simultaneously. I'm a Capricorn, and Capricorns tend to be like rooted and very practical. So I'm that too. And so I'm not under some illusion that we live in some idealistic notion, a nation, right? Or some idealized state. So while I say we need to push back against private ownership of land, we're trying to buy the land that our farm is on. And so what we have to do is we have to what we call hold contradictions, that as we're moving from where we are to where we like to be, there's many things that are in contradiction that we have to acknowledge. And the reality is you're going to hold those contradictions if you're in American society. You can't just go in a cave and escape, the forces that shape society. And so the question is, how do we first acknowledge those contradictions and then minimize them and then move towards a state of resolving those contradictions? But in the meantime, we have to kind of acknowledge, yes, that private ownership of land has been a thing that has concentrated land and power and wealth in the hands mostly of wealthy white men, and that's probably not a good thing. But then also the way that farmers get security in society now is by owning the land. So another idea that needs to be challenged is this idea that is taught by many religions, and I'm not criticizing anyone's religion or spiritual practices, whatever path you might use to align yourself with whatever you believe to be the forces that control the universe. That's fine. I'm not stepping on that. But we find that many religions teach that man has dominion over the earth. Western religious doctrines and institutions have promoted the idea that humans have the right and responsibility to subdue, capture, and rule the earth and the animals and planets with which we co-inhabit the planet. This thinking is inaccurate, antiquated, and will lead to our extinction. We are part of a delicate matrix of life with complex relationships that are interdependent and reciprocal. And if you don't believe it, a lot of times we walk around, stick our chests out. I'm a human, right? But we totally dependent on insects for agriculture, totally dependent on insects. And so this idea that we're here to dominate the earth, again, is something that will lead to our extinction. If we realize, as many cultures did, that, the ant is our brother, and sounds silly, but it's real. The bee is our sister, whatever. Once we adopt that and realize that we're not bigger, better than bees and insects, we're not. People say, well, we got free will, or, maybe, yeah, whatever. The reality is that we're codependent. It's a reciprocal relationship. And so we have to get out of this idea of dominating the earth and figure out how we fit into the matrix of life in a way which is fair and balanced and creates life and a future for ourselves. Another area, idea that needs to be challenged. You got my back on this, Moby? You got my back, Lena? Angela, you got my back? So another area that needs to be challenged is this idea that God, Jesus, and Mary are white. And again, if you're Christian, that's fine. I'm not stepping on anybody's religion. But I'm stepping on the Europeanized version of the religion that has been fed to us that goes hand in hand with imperialism and colonialism in order to get us to conceptualize the divine in the image of the very people who enslaved my people. And so you're in a real bad situation when you see the deity in the same image as the person who's hitting you across the back with the whip. And you're in a real bad situation if you're a black child and you look at this picture of this person you've been taught is Jesus, which is variously described as either the Son of God or 1 in 3. I never understood any of that math, but however all that works. But so if you look at this image that's supposed to represent God, and it doesn't look like you, then you feel somehow that you're less close to God than the people that look like this image. And so it's a terrible trick that's been played that has helped to subdue people throughout the earth, and also to give people who are considered to be white this tremendous sense of empowerment, this sense of manifest destiny, this sense that somehow they are closer to the divine than other people on the planet. Europeans have hijacked and distorted images and concepts related to how we conceptualize the divine. We've been tricked into seeing the divine in the images of the Europeans who colonized our lands and enslaved our ancestors. This reinforces concepts like manifest destiny and white saviorism. For black people, it diminishes our belief in our own divinity and our ability to shape our own destiny. Another idea that needs to be challenged is individualism. Woven into the fabric of American culture is the idea that we advance in life as a result of our individual intelligence, abilities, and efforts. It ignores the systemic barriers that the majority of black people in America experience as they attempt to improve their lot in life. It denies the role that community and cooperation play in success. Our survival is dependent upon seeing that our destinies are linked and that the group gives meaning to the individual life. Another idea that needs to be challenged, is patriarchy. Particularly harmful is the idea that men are somehow superior and more worthy of leadership than women, that women are evil, cursed, unclean, and irrational, that women should be suppressed, controlled, and decided for, that lineage should be traced through the lines of the father. These ideas have resulted in a system in which power is concentrated in the hands of men. The survival of humanity depends in large part upon lifting up women and unleashing the fierce power of feminine energy. Another idea that needs to be challenged is bigger is better. The systems that provide energy, food, and transportation are fragile in part as a result of their size. The idea that what is needed is more profit, more production, and more consumption drives Western development. Smaller can be better, cleaner, safer, more efficient, and more easily controlled by communities. We must continue to advance the struggle against police murder and inequalities in the so-called criminal justice system. We need to extend that struggle to every major institution in American society, all of which are mirrored in the mud of the system of white supremacy. While we advance our struggle for human rights and dignity, let us also challenge the ideas that keep the system of oppression afloat. Black ideas matter. So I just wanted to start out with that little piece, just to just kind of set the tone. In fact, yeah. So it's all related. It wasn't directly about food, but hopefully y'all got the connections. So I want to talk now more specifically about. So this is kind of about creating a racially just food system. Yeah, kind of, sort of. So, but this is the thing. So in order to create a racially just food system, there's a couple things that have to happen. One, it's true that we have to change policy in the larger society, right? That's important. And we have to struggle against, Monsanto controlling seeds, and we have to struggle against, the Farm Bill reducing SNAP benefits. And we have to struggle against all of these kind of things in the larger society that impede the ability of people to meet their basic needs. But the other side of this, the other side of creating a just food system is that those who are most marginalized have to organize and build power among themselves. I'm going to tell you straight up. I come from a tradition that's called the Black Nationalist Pan-Africanist tradition. Sometimes we get a bad rap. People call us hoteps and all that kind of stuff, Some of y'all probably call people hoteps. No. And, to be fair, it's not a monolithic tradition. There's some very backwards tendencies within it, and there's some very progressive tendencies within it. But this idea is based on the fact that in order for black people to progress, it has much more to do with what we do among ourselves than what white people do or don't do, frankly. Right? And so part of creating a racially just food system is building power within black communities so that we can shape our own destiny and shape how we interact with the food system. And so that's the nature of my remarks. And so we got Fannie Lou up there also. And she said, you can pray until you faint, but unless you get up and try to do something, God is not going to put it in your lap. And so I want to start with that idea that prayer is good. And I pray, I do that. But you also have to act, right? You can't just pray. You have to. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, and I want to start with that because what we need to do is we need to build a movement. And while I'm for building and participate in the larger food movement, what we sometimes call the food movement, I am specifically for black folks who participate in that movement organizing a black food movement because we have some interests that are unique And we have to protect our interests because as white people are trying, those white people who are trying to recover from white supremacy, and what I found is that usually in the food movement, we have kind of more liberal white people, right, who are maybe conscious of these concepts and are doing the introspective work. Sometimes I say, y'all not real white people, right? There's some real white people out there who aren't thinking at all about, how they can be introspective about their privilege, and they're not thinking about none of that, right? So while we need to, participate in the larger movement, it would be folly for us not to build the kind of power and strength and resilience that we need within our communities to make sure that our interests are protected and advanced. So I mentioned no social justice, no food justice. These things are not disconnected. This is in Philadelphia last week, a protest where 2 brothers were arrested at Starbucks for waiting while black. So there's some points that I think are important for us to analyze. I mentioned this earlier, that our communities are hemorrhaging economically due to the extractive economic practices that we find. And the same scenario plays out in different cities depending on where you are. In Detroit, the ethnic groups that owns the majority of the stores is a group called Chaldeans from Iraq. You go to another city, it might be Vietnamese. You go to another city, it might be Indians. So the problem is not the ethnic group. And so I'm not hating on Vietnamese or Indians or Chaldeans. The problem is that we live in a system that pits groups against each other. And because the black community has been historically underdeveloped, for example, in Detroit, we had a thriving black business district called Black Bottom, and they built a freeway, I-75, right through it and destroyed it. Same thing happened in Atlanta and many other cities, because what urban planners would do is they were looking at how to route freeways. They would look at the areas that had the lowest property values, which were generally the areas that we lived in. And so we had these business districts that were destroyed. And so now, in the face of a destroyed kind of black capacity to operate businesses in our own community, then other ethnic groups come in, open up stores. They don't live in the community. In Detroit, at least, they often don't hire people who are residents of the community. They're often disrespectful to people in the community. And then they extract huge amounts of money out of our community that we see no benefit from. And so this has got to stop. It's got to end, and it's on us to make sure it ends. There are less than 10 black grocery stores nationally. There are no black grocery stores in the city of Detroit, a city of 700,000 people. There are no black grocery stores in Michigan. I'm told there's no black grocery stores in the Midwest, right? There's less than 10 in the whole country. We see throughout the United States black farmers continuing to lose land. We had the case of Eddie Wise and his wife in North Carolina last week, whose farm was taken by the USDA, after they struggled against it. And we know many of us know about the historical struggles to get equality within USDA and the Pickford suits and all of that, because of the recognition and the admission by the USDA of the historic discriminatory practices in regards to loans. And so this legacy has created a vulnerability on the part of black farmers, where black farmers are continuing to lose land. All of this has devastating health consequences for us. All the major indices of health, we find that black people are off the charts: high blood pressure, diabetes, childhood, adult obesity, all of those things. And all of those things are controllable in part by diet. So the thing about the food movement, what we find in our communities often, and I'm addressing mainly the black folks right now. The white folks, y'all can just listen in to this part, like fishbowl kind of thing they call it, right? So what we find in the community I live in is, among the black people who want to make progress, you got different schools of thought. So you got some people say, I'm in the Nation of Islam. I follow Minister Farrakhan. Then you got somebody else, I'm Rastafari. And you got the next person, I'm a Moor. Then you got somebody else, I'm with the Shrine of the Black Madonna. We got all these different ways that we divide. I'm a Baptist. I'm a Methodist. I'm an African Methodist Episcopal. I'm First Baptist. I'm New Reform. We got all these ways that we divide ourselves up, and often these things get in the way of us working together. And we also divide ourselves up by gender. We divide ourselves, oh, he's gay, I can't work with him, or whatever, or we find all these ways that we divide ourselves, and we can't galvanize the collective strength that we need to move forward. So the thing about it, though, is that everybody eats. And so it becomes a platform almost like no other platform to unite people across these differences. I don't know if these same differences exist in white communities or not. They may, but I'm just speaking on my experience. And so, sure they do, somebody say? Say it again. Okay, yeah. So I guess that exists. And I'm not denying other experience. I'm just speaking from my own experience. So I've also mentioned that capturing even a small percentage of the money spent by black people would result in millions of dollars that we could use to fund our own institutions, that we could use to fund farms, that we could buy farmland, but the money's just bleeding out of our communities. So one of the organizations that's doing something about this is the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And I just want to big up Sister Hunter. Hunter, where you at? Throw your hands up. Put your hands up in the air. Okay. And so that's her right there on that corner. She's part of the leadership team. She's right here in Cleveland. And she's the youngest member of our leadership team. So I want to big you up big time. If you don't know Hunter, please get with her. But the National Black Food and Justice Alliance is one effort to galvanize black people across the country and move from these kind of scattered little liberated zones and scattered efforts to create gardens here and gardens there and a food co-op here and a food co-op there to build a movement so that we can move in a way that's much more powerful than we can if we're scattered individuals. These are some of the areas that I think we need to look at in terms of action and development. Land ownership, and again, even though I strongly push back against the whole idea of owning part of the earth within the context of the current capitalist system, that's about the only way you can obtain some land. And so we need to be focused on how do we protect the existing black farmland that we have? How do we access additional land? And I'm using the word access because sometimes you can be on some land that you don't own, so-called own, and we need to do that too. And we need to figure out how do we own more of it. So this is a critical area if we're really serious about building a food movement that can create greater self-reliance within black communities. We need to put much more emphasis on agriculture. African people in the United States have a particular challenge due to our experiences of being enslaved and participating as sharecroppers and other tenant farmers. And so many black people, the only lens that we can see agriculture work from is these exploitive lenses that used our labor in order to enrich whites. And so we have to turn that around and now begin to promote within our communities that agriculture can be used as a form of community self-determination to build wealth, health, community resilience, and create a forum for us to work together collectively. Food co-ops, I've already mentioned this, and by the way, this is a rendering of the Detroit Food Commons that we're building in Detroit. It's gonna be dope. It's gonna be dope. It's gonna be dope. If you don't know, you better ask somebody. In fact, like they say in Detroit, you better ask somebody, A-X-E. You better ask somebody. So again, food co-ops are critical. We can't depend on just the corporate sector to provide our food. In fact, a friend of mine says, one of my teachers in this work says that children and pets are fed, men and women feed themselves. So I just want to let that resonate with you. Uh-oh, Mo B. She's in my PowerPoint wherever I go throughout the country because she's my sister and she's doing good work. And we have to promote those who are doing good work. So this is her speaking at the Detroit Food Policy Council annual conference a couple months ago, I think it was. And policy is important. Now, I think I've clearly said that I think our major effort should be in self-determination. How do we galvanize our own efforts to make change? But at the same time, policy matters. And if you don't think policy matters, ask those people that ICE is gathering up and deporting from the country, right? So I know that's happening in Michigan. I don't know to what extent it's happening in Ohio, but policy does matter. And so we have to deal with that intelligently. And so one of the ways to deal with that is through food policy councils, and this is one of the efforts that we have going on in Detroit. I mentioned earlier that we have all these scattered kind of pockets of resistance. We need to find ways to connect those. And often, we want everybody to like dress how we dress and speak the way we dress and speak the way we speak and, eat the way we eat. I don't care. I'm a vegan. I can unite with you if you're concerned about black self-determination and having healthy food in black communities. You can eat a raw pork sandwich. I don't care. I do not care, and we have to find a way to have principled unity without uniformity. We don't have to agree on everything. Let's find the things that we do agree on and use those as the basis of building a movement. But we're also not in a bubble. So black people in America are not the only human beings on the face of the earth. And so we need to make meaningful linkages with other black people doing similar work in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the diaspora. And again, this Pan-African idea is an idea advanced by Dr. Du Bois, advanced in other forms by Marcus Garvey, and in more recent times by people like Kwame Nkrumah. But this kind of understanding that a united international African community can be a power base to serve for the protection of black people throughout the world is an idea that still has a tremendous amount of validity. We should also develop mutually supportive relationships with indigenous people throughout the world. So this idea of food sovereignty has come to us primarily through La Via Campesina, an international organization of people who work the land, many of whom are in Latin America, so-called Latin America. Man, all these terms are messed up, right? Latin America. Excuse me for even saying that. In Central America, so-called Central America, so-called South America, where you have brown people who are doing farming and who are finding ways to take back the land, like in Brazil, the MST, is occupying land and taking land back. So we need to be in solidarity with people around the world who are doing that. And then finally, we need to interact with the larger food movement in the United States on issues where we have mutual interests. So I'm not against working with white people. I think when it makes sense to do that, there's some issues that affect all of us. For example, climate change doesn't discriminate, if you're black, brown, white, or whatever, it'll wipe us all out. And so on those things that affect us commonly, mutually, we need to find ways to work together. Monica mentioned this, and I'll mention this as I'm nearing the closing of my talk, that we need to be shifting the narrative. The stories that we're told shape how we see reality. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. So at the top, this is Sister Jerry Ann Hebron, who runs a dynamic program in Detroit called the Oakland Avenue Farm in an area called the North End of Detroit. And she is utilizing farming as a way of creating jobs in the community, of creating access to food. They have a farmer's market. They've infused arts into it. They have festivals where you got poets and artists and visual artists. And they are creating a vibrant community out of a community that had been disinvested in and had been left to rot. She's doing incredible work. If you were to Google urban agriculture in Detroit, the first thing that would come up is a group called the Michigan Urban Farming Initiative, which is also in the north end of Detroit, a few blocks from Jerry's operation, and it's run by Tyson Gersh. Tyson is a graduate of the University of Michigan from a very well-to-do family who decided that 6 years ago he was going to move to Detroit to this majority African-American community, and because of the abundance of vacant land, was going to create an agricultural organization and project. Last year, emails went out throughout the world. Stuff went out on Facebook and all the social media when they announced they were creating the world's first agri-hood. How many people saw that? You missed it? Good. I'm glad you did too. So, dude, in all fairness, his thing, it looks like real nice. It looks very nice. Everything's in straight rows and it's clean and they're growing lots of food. No, seriously. I mean, I'm not, it's not that they're not doing a good job at farming. That's not the point. But the point is the values that are driving what they're doing as opposed to these values. And you'll hear a lot about him. Again, if you Google, this will be the first thing that pops up. And so because that's the first thing that pops up, when corporations say, oh, we want to give some money to help Detroit, maybe in urban ag, then, and his face that is the one that pops up and his story pops up constantly, then it's going to be more likely that the funds are going to go to him than to her, who is doing legitimate work in the community she grew up in and has a long-term interest in. So this is an example of how the narrative needs to be shifted. Another example, this is my sister Nadine Nelson, who's in Connecticut, and she's a chef and a food activist. This is Mark Bittman, who for many years wrote for the New York Times. You all familiar with him? A few people. And he's written a number of books. Now, in all fairness, I know both of them. Nadine is a friend and a sister. Mark Bittman, I would say, has been an ally. He's been to our farm. He's been supportive of us. And generally, within the food movement, he's on the right side of things. He generally, takes very progressive positions. In November, they were at a place called the Stone Barn Farm in upstate New York, where they had a meeting of some new farmers, kind of a fellowship, and Nadine was part of that, and Mark Bittman was one of the keynote speakers. And Nadine has been a fan of Mark Bittman for years, let me say that. In fact, she took an article that he wrote in the New York Times and developed a curriculum around it to teach young people in her city in Connecticut. And she had tried to reach out to him a few times prior to him being at Stone Barn to let him know about this curriculum that she had developed and to kind of get his feedback and input. And she tells me she was just blown off by him, basically. So at this event, she was the president. He was speaking. After he spoke, and he talks a lot about creating, justice and racial justice within the food system. So Nadine, during the Q&A question, asked him, what are you doing to hold yourself accountable to communities of color? And his answer was, I don't know what you mean by that. And he just kind of left it at that. Now, to his credit, the next day he apologized. He realized he had messed up really bad, and he issued an apology, which was a good apology. And so this is not to smash Mark Bittman, because I think he's a progressive force. But for us in the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, it raises a larger question. And that question is, who speaks for the food movement, right? Is it just Mark Bittman and Michael Pollan and, folks like that? Or is it the hundreds of black and brown farmers that we see throughout the country, as we travel around, who are really advancing this work and raising the profile of sustainable agriculture? Why is it that, again, we know why it is. White male patriarchy, and white supremacy, all those reasons are the reasons that his voice is more likely to be heard than her voice. So I want to end, and thank you for bearing with me. I know I probably went way over time. I went way over. Did you hold that up? Oh, you just holding it up for the first time? You were waiting. Okay. So the way I got into this work with farming and food is that for about 22 years, I ran an African-centered school in Detroit. And I don't have time enough right now to go into what an African-centered school is. But we were developing young black children who had a healthy sense of confidence in themselves because they were taught in an environment that reflected their own culture and helped them understand where they fit into their own historical and cultural continuum. And we also were politicizing them, helping them to kind of understand the context that they live their lives in. We were trying to develop a new generation of activists. We taught martial arts and we taught self-defense. And, we taught people never to be the aggressor. But, if somebody wants to do some damage to you, you have the right to defend yourself. So this sister here, Sawatu Salama Ra, was a student at our school for many years. Our school is a K-8 school. And she was actually in the same class as my youngest son, who's 26. And after graduating from high school, she went on to become an activist. She followed kind of the path that had been laid out before her. And she is specifically an environmental activist. She's co-director of a group in Detroit called the East Michigan Environmental Action Council. She's gone around the world. She was in Paris at the Climate Accord talks, and she's spoken across the United States. She's organized young people around environmental issues. Last July, she had a conflict with a neighbor on her mother's block. And this neighbor rammed Siwatu's car that had her 2-year-old daughter in it, and then tried to run over with the car Siwatu and her mother. Siwatu had a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And so she drew her weapon to back this woman up who was trying to run over her and her mother. And she did back the woman up, but the woman called the police. And because she called the police and she was the first to file the report, Siwatu was charged and subsequently convicted of felonious assault and the use of a lethal weapon in the commission of a felony. Siwatu is currently 7 months pregnant. She is serving a 2-year sentence in a prison in Michigan. At this point, she looks like she's going to give birth in prison in June. I was at her sentencing. At the sentencing, her attorneys tried to get the judge to delay her reporting for her 2-year sentence until after June when she gives birth. That was denied. Wherever we go around the country, we're uplifting Siwatu, encouraging people to join the Free Siwatu campaign. There's a website, freesiwatu.org, freesiwatu.org, freesiwatu.org. We want to lift that up because, again, the struggle for food justice is related to the struggle for social justice. Peace.
All right, Janice.
Come on down.
I was teasing Eric, telling him not to take any pictures. He knows I hate having my picture taken. To you both, I want to say thank you for returning. I try to be here every year, and you all give me new food, literally and figuratively, every time you come. I, like most people in Cleveland, have relatives in Detroit. I am there 4 or 5 times a year intentionally. I love the city. And Malik, my question is for you. When you all build the Detroit Food Commons, how are you going to drive your audience from Eastern Market to the neighborhood on Woodward?
So we don't really see ourselves as driving the audience from Eastern Market. So for the sake of people who don't know Detroit, Eastern Market is a large publicly owned market where farmers come every Saturday and Tuesday and sell at the market. So, probably that will continue pretty much unimpeded, but there's enough people in Detroit who are disgusted with the style of development, the kind of Dan Gilbert-driven development that we're seeing in Detroit, where wealthy white men are controlling all of the development. And so enough people are disgusted with that and want to see an alternative that they'll support that. And then also in the neighborhood we're located in, the North End, there's only one grocery store, which is a really poor quality store. So there's a demand right in that immediate neighborhood. And then also we'll be selling more than the produce that they sell at Eastern Market. This will be a full grocery store that will be cooperatively owned.
And also, I take students to Flint once or twice a year, and we always base ourselves in Detroit. So we actually went to your youth meeting the last time we were there last year. And so I want to know if you still have the meetings in the same place during the week.
So I'm not sure exactly which one you went to. Our youth program is in 2 places now, Timbuktu Academy of Science and Technology and the Shrine of the Black Madonna. I'm not sure which.
Where were we? Off Livernois, I think we were.
That's where our office was. But you can see me afterwards, and I can make sure you have the information so when you visit, you can connect with where we are.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Greetings.
Peace.
Peace. My name is Sister Angela. I'm with the Little Africa Food Collaborative. We're in the process of trying to open a Black-owned food co-op here in Cleveland. So, greetings, peace and blessings to you all. My question is around Black food security in a more general sense, and our need to build a value-added supply chain from growing to consumer. I mean, from an academic perspective and experiential, how would you maybe give an overview of a strategy and or maybe a baseline where we are to measure? I heard you say there's only 10 Black-owned grocery stores in the United States, and then coming from Milwaukee, the food co-op, we were represented
okay. We were there, but the majority still. And then just the other aspects in terms of growing to us making, and then owning retail. If you could give a measurement or just an overview based on your knowledge, how would you describe where we are?
How would we describe where we are in terms of a black food system?
The whole value added, this whole value added supply chain as it pertains to black food security. So if we were looking at the whole pie, right? What representation do we have as growers, farmers? What do we have as retail owners and co-ops? What do we have as, those making products that we can sell? Where are we? And then the next question to that is, how can we advance that?
So I want to take the second part first because as a sociologist and as a historical sociologist, what I've really done is sort of looked at the organizations that have done the kind of work that organizations like DBCFSN are engaged in now and looking at what they did and what was effective. I think in terms of what this looks like, so the research question came from the work we were doing in Detroit, and hearing the conversation of cooperative, I knew that there had to have been other moments in history when we wanted to use cooperatives as a frame, and this is before Dr. Nemhart's book came out. So I wanted to sort of see how had cooperatives developed. And I think, so that then forced me to go down south, right, and to connect with traditional farmers in rural communities. Mr. Ben Burkett is the farmer's farmer, and organizations such as the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And so for me, in thinking about how do we advance, which was your second question, it really is in taking an assessment of who we have, who's doing what and where are we doing it, and trying to find ways to build that work together, right? And so for me, hearing and seeing these elder farmers, many of whom in their 60s and 70s, and those of us who grow food, we know how hard that work is. And then those who help them are also in their 60s and 70s, right? And so for me, I'm always trying to think about the ways that we can link the youthful excitement of urban food justice movements, sending these young folks down to the elders who still have land in the South, who are traditional farmers. One of the funny conversations, we're proud of our 7 acres. When I went down to the Babas down in Mississippi, and I was like, we have a 7-acre organic farm. And they were like, oh, that's cute, baby. We got 7-acre rows. Right? And so there is knowledge that these elders have, access to land, and being able to draw connections between the urban and the rural, the North and the South, the youth and the elders. So identifying who's doing what, I think some of the work, Dara Cooper's report really sort of talks about food hubs and black folk doing important work around the nation. I also think that, identifying who's doing what and how do we build. So thinking about ways that Detroit can contribute to and connect to Cleveland and Milwaukee, and how do we do this and how do we begin those kinds of conversations. So in terms of where we stand right now, I think my work has been such historical focused that Baba Malik has been more active in what's happening today and can speak to your first question. Like that punt?
Yeah, that was slick. So first of all, let me say I don't have the answer to your question, but I can tell you from traveling around the country that it's pretty dismal in terms of where we fall, in terms of having the elements to build a self-reliant kind of closed loop system. So we do have a number of farmers in the South and other places too. I mean, there's black farmers in Michigan and other places. But there's a real dilemma, and one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do we get black grown food on the black plates? It seemed like a simple question, but this is the dilemma. And Ben Burkett, who she just mentioned, shared this with me, that one of the challenges is, first of all, he has to sell in a certain quantity. Most of the times when black folks are trying to buy, they say, well, I want 1 box of this and so he ends up having to sell to Trader Joe's because they're buying stuff by the truckload, and there's a certain economy of scale that he has to function on to make it make sense. He can't sell 1 box here, 1 box there. He got to sell a truckload at a time. And so there's that problem. But then the other challenge is, let's say he wants to send a 18-wheeler refrigerated truck from Mississippi to Detroit full of collard greens.
Watermelon.
Or watermelons or whatever.
Right.
You can't send an empty truck back.
That's right.
In the trucking industry, is what they call deadheading.
That's right.
And so it doesn't make economic sense to send an empty truck, because whatever profit you made, you burn up sending that truck on a useless trip. And so the reality is, if we want to create this closed loop system, we have to be producing something of value wherever we are. So that the truck might not be taking food back to Mississippi, but it's taking something that we manufactured in Detroit. So wherever we are, we have to be productive and be creating something that has value, so we can then begin to trade those things with each other. But the National Black Food and Justice Alliance is concerned about this very question. So we are engaging right now in a mapping exercise to try to determine where are black people throughout the country that are starting food co-ops, where are black people throughout the country that own land, where are black people that are owning grocery stores or owning restaurants. We want to map the foodscape so that we have an answer to that question, and then we can begin to make those linkages.
I don't see anybody else at the mic, so I'm going to ask one more question. How do we engage the diaspora? I mean, because just in terms of what you said already, we're struggling here, right, just amongst ourselves. But in terms of having the external food sourcing, how do we engage the diaspora? And is there any activity from, your perspective going on in that space?
Yeah, there has been some activity. There's been many efforts. But it gets really complicated when you start dealing with international trade and trying to bring yams from West Africa here, or rice. So there was a friend of mine in Toronto who was bringing rice from Ghana. It's a very complicated process, but we need to be trying it. And so there's a lot of black folks that travel to the Caribbean, a lot of black folks from the Caribbean, or have parents from the Caribbean, or whatever the case may be. And there's a lot of black folks traveling to Africa. But oftentimes we just go because we're trying to, check out the beach, which I'm not knocking that, or we're trying to, connect with our ancestral heritage. I'm just suggesting we can add another element into it. And as we're doing that, try to figure out how do we connect on the food level too, what connections can we make? There's a brother in Jamaica, for example, from Detroit, that's producing a beverage that he's selling throughout the United States. So there are some efforts. We need to identify them, lift them up, and figure out how we build on them.
I wanted to follow up on that question as well. So, I mean, the model seems very vibrant. The economic cooperative justice model, political education, the practice of democracy, and so forth. So how do you raise capital? I mean, what are the mechanisms? What do you do, right? Because you do have the Dan Gilberts moving in, and you do have the political and economic elites who are just as interested in starving that side of the city while they're investing over here on this side of the city. So how do you do that? What are the mechanisms that you use to raise capital?
You want me to speak on it? So unfortunately, that's what I deal with every day. And as much as I hate capitalism, I spend a lot of time sitting down with capitalists. And it's made me hate capitalism even more, to tell you the truth.
You gotta walk.
Yeah, it's a contradiction I'm walking. Yeah. So this project we're building is an $11 million project. And we're not gonna build it by bake sales and car washes. And so what we have to do is we have to go to the people that have the money, and usually they sell money. That's what it boils down to. They sell it to you at a certain interest rate. So there's a certain amount of debt financing involved in our project, both traditional debt financing, and also we're using a federal instrument called New Markets Tax Credits, which kind of delays the payment of the principal for 7 years. You only pay interest for the first 7 years, with the idea that you can get the business up and running, then you start paying the principal back. So the majority of the funding is through that mechanism, but also we're using member owner equity in the co-op. So members pay $200 to become a member owner, and that's another funding source. Then we had one athlete who donated $360,000, a former player on the Detroit football team, the Detroit Lions. And I want to say this, that often we hear criticism of black entertainers and black sports figures and say, oh, they're not doing nothing. Jay-Z ain't doing nothing. He making all the... We don't really know what people are doing, because this guy dropped a $360,000 check on us, and he was like, I don't even want you to say anything. I said, well, can we at least tell people you made a donation? He reluctantly allowed me to take his pic. He wasn't doing it for the fame and glory and credit. So that's another way. But I'm just saying, you know, we shouldn't count out people who might be in the entertainment industry or sports industry, and we don't always know what they're doing. Prince, for example, after he passed, we find out he's funding all kind of stuff. He didn't talk about it. So, you know, we need to find out what resources we have in our community and what people have the value system that might encourage them to support projects like that.
Are there like community banks? Are you working with community banks or community financial institutions as well in terms of circulating money, or has that
So
something
when you
you've
say
tried?
community finance, you're talking about like community CDFIs? Yeah, we're working with some of them, but you know, there's certain rules there's a certain logic to capitalism, and all of them are bound by the logic of capitalism. And basically that logic says that if, let's say, take Mo B next to me, if she want to go to the bank and borrow $1 million, she essentially has to already have $1 million or something worth $1 million, because the bank wants to know, if you default on the loan, how do we get our money back? And so it's a self-replicating system. So CDFIs are not exempt from that logic. They're locked into that logic as well. And so what that means is that those who already have wealth and access to wealth are positioned, and this is a term I've learned meeting with these capitalists, they use a term they call capital ready. So, and having the collateral is one aspect of being capital ready. It's not the only aspect. But if you got resources already, you're in a position to get more resources. If you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing coming. That's basically how that goes.
Thank you so much. Both of the presentations were wonderful for me. I'm an educator, and I teach college students. And one of the things that really worries me these days is trying to communicate to the young people the value of Black culture, Black lifestyles, philosophies, worldviews, practices, and everything. And so, for as an example, I'm teaching a class now in linguistics, and it's focused on Black English. And I'm having a hard time getting the students to care that, you know, what is devalued in the community, the speakers of Black English and the speech community, creates so much wealth for these corporations as soon as it leaves the Black community on the internet, right? And I'm having a hard time getting the students to care, you know, and it kind of worries me. So my question is, do you guys have sort of advice to people working with young people on how to get young people to really see the value of things that are Black before they leave the Black world, so that we don't have to hemorrhage for things to gain value? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I can just talk about it in terms of, I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and every year I go on a serious effort to try to recruit graduate students to work with, and especially students of African-American descent. I work with anybody, but also I'm committed to making sure that this knowledge is, you know, just the methods and the theoretical frameworks, you know, just are shared. And so I struggle every year with trying to get graduate students, students to come to Wisconsin. I also have to do a lot when it comes to my classes to make sure that my classes are representative. So I end up going to all kinds of work. Like I have to recruit, I have to have a commercial almost. You know, and this is just in the university environment. I think one of the problems that I have found is that our students come to the university to identify some solutions or begin to think about how they can create solutions to the problems that plague our communities. And when they come to universities, what often happens is that they are taught that who they are and where they come from, that there's this, you know, effort to disentangle or to detach from their culture, right? And as you talk about, you know, how do we talk about Black language and then, you know, as a way to embrace our culture, and yet students, you know, tend to sort of shy away or feel a certain kind of way about those classes. So my goal has always been to encourage students to come to me, and I feel like I have a toolbox. And I try to convince them of the value of the tools in the toolbox to answer whatever social condition or whatever social question it is that they're seeking. And I have found that to be much more successful in saying, you know, are you interested in environmental issues? Are you interested in food-related issues? Are you interested in sociology as a discipline? Are you interested in, you know, cooperatives? Are you interested in freedom and justice? And helping them to sort of look at their families and look at their communities as a source of information and as a place to where we can return to take the skills that we've learned in the university. You can speak on recruiting for food warriors and other kinds of the organization's activities, right?
Nah. But I do want to say something else.
Okay.
I just want to add another element to the conversation. And this is not really an answer to your question, but it's a response. That's what politicians do. They give a response, but it's not an answer. So there was a time when black students were very interested in black culture.
That's right.
So what happened? It wasn't that long ago. No, it wasn't that long ago. And I'm a product of that time period, right? So something happened. And what happened is that the United States government, through COINTELPRO and all the other related police-type agencies across the United States, made a concerted effort to smash any organization that was involved in the Black liberation movement. And so then we have a whole generation of young people who grew up absent those influences. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't get into what Malcolm X called blaming the victim. Because the fact that young people are not interested or are not knowledgeable about black culture is not their fault. It's the fault of living in a society which systematically smashed most of the efforts to make black people more aware of these things. And then flooded the communities with crack and all kind of things. So they grew up in that environment. And even with the whole gangster rap, there's been a lot of information about how that was planned out. This stuff is not happening happenstance. We know about the deal where they were bringing drugs from Nicaragua, or I forgot how it went down. The Iran-Contra deal, I forgot exactly how that went. But the bottom line, the United States government was bringing drugs into the United States. So, all of these things work together. So I just want to make sure we don't blame young people, because I think there's some very dynamic young people who are doing lots of things. Finally, I want to say that there's a relationship between the desire of young people to know about their culture and history and a strong social movement. So when you have strong social movements that are struggling for justice and equality, you have an increase in the desire to learn about their history and culture. In the absence of those movements, then we enter into this kind of dim zone that we find ourselves in now.
Any other questions? Monica, I was thinking when you were talking about disasters, and disasters are happening, of course, with our climate conditions, we're probably looking at a lot more of them happening, right, in the future. And how it brings out, in some ways, the best in our communities, but also brings out sort of the worst, right? So the best is that, working people come together, they take care of one another and so on. And yet, as Naomi Klein has taught us, this is where capital goes, right? Disaster capitalism, and they're going to privatize everything, as we saw in Katrina, as we see in Puerto Rico now, and so forth. Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but it just seems like that this is something we have to start mobilizing around, preparing for, and so forth, particularly because we know there's going to be a lot more of this.
Yeah. The whole situation in Detroit was manufactured, right? Just the idea that this bankruptcy was allowed to come in and wipe out people's pensions. So they didn't go to and to force the city to share ownership of the water department, right? Access to water is important. So there are lots of examples that we see. And, we were just mentioning, I don't have a clue as to what Puerto Rico is going to look like in its rebuilding. But we have to also recognize who are the people that are going to make money off of the disaster will not be the people who live there right now, right? And the same for Detroit. I drive down the street and I don't even recognize my own city. And the idea that, we want safe streets. We want to be able to ride our bikes. We want access to, and so this manufactured, this capital, the disaster capital, really benefits and profits off of, and what did Mama Charity used to say, urban renewal is Negro removal, right? And so in those places, and folks in Detroit always had this idea that we were being moved out of the city. We just didn't know what that mechanism would look like. And so I think that, my research focuses more on the ways that communities fight back, the ways that communities resist, the ways that communities, build new communities understand or using agriculture or food systems or food as a strategy to do so. And yeah, I mean, I think that we should be concerned about what's happening in Detroit, like we should be paying attention to Puerto Rico, and we should hold ourselves accountable for knowledge about what's happening and having a voice and making sure that it returns to the people who were the ones who built those entities.
Can I add just a little bit to that?
Sure, of course.
So a few weeks ago, I met some activists from Puerto Rico who were in Detroit, and they're coming to Detroit to study the whole bankruptcy in Detroit. Because, and this is deep, so what happens with international capitalism is they develop a scheme and then kind of perfect that and then replicate that same model. And so Judge Stephen Rose, who presided over the bankruptcy in Detroit, is now presiding over the bankruptcy in Puerto Rico.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Imagine that.
Imagine. Wow. I don't believe in coincidence.
Me either.
Not at all.
Hey now.
Yeah, well, you know, I have been once again enlightened and empowered by what you have said today and yesterday. And people in Cleveland, I mean, we are at 111th and Euclid Avenue, and less than 2 miles to the east on the same street, there is a division. In many areas in this city, you can do that and literally go from very eclectic communities to blighted. And at the same time, urban farmers that don't come from means and aren't hooked up with large philanthropic organizations, you get a lot of pushback from the elected officials. Like I said, less than 2 miles away east, there's a community called East Cleveland, Ohio, which when I grew up as a little girl was 98% white. Prior to the Black Power movement of the late 60s, the Lakeview riots and whatnot, was a panacea of abundance, economic and educational, everything that you would want. Fast forward 40 years, you have a situation of 3.5 miles with one grocery store. And you have politicians that look like you and I who continue to have their foot on the necks of the people who want to come in and build. There's no such thing as getting a hold of vacant land there. And it echoes itself across this Cuyahoga County area. Back when I first started my gardening company, and Kim can attest to it, it was folly downtown trying to get land to do the right things by the people who live in the city and in the county. And we won't get into history today, because if they really told real history from Kemet and what Ningus actually means and everything else that they've stripped and scorned and bastardized, you know. But until we get back to that, until we get back to the point that we are electric people, we've been poisoned by what, systematically poisoned, by the way, by what they've been feeding us intentionally, you know, with a value meal attached to it, you know, and until we get to that point and understanding that our young people have been taught that through the gangster rap, through the BBBs and Bs, the bitches, bottles, blowjobs, and bullets, you know, it's not empowering to learn how to feed your family, feed your neighborhood. You know, that's degrading to work the soil, when in fact, it's everything. We don't eat, we don't eat. You don't live. That's those people down in Puerto Rico. They would love to farm right now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming, and especially thank Monica and Malik for leaving us with so much food for thought.